All right, hello everyone. Welcome to our second lesson on Vietnam. This is called Escalation. Okay, so we have our objectives and standards. Our objectives: understand how U.S. troops became more engaged in the fighting in Vietnam, and analyze the environment in Vietnam and its impact on fighting. If you would please take a look at the standards. Okay, so our vocab: Army of the Republic of Vietnam. That is the another name for the South Vietnamese Army. We'll talk about them a little bit. Napalm. Napalm is a gasoline-based bomb that set fire to the jungles of Vietnam, and we'll explain how that was used. Also, Agent Orange, another weapon used by American forces, which is a toxic leaf-killing chemical used during the fighting. Credibility gap is an attack by opponents of the Johnson administration in regards to events occurring in Vietnam. So we'll explain this a little bit, but it's going to play out in the next couple lessons as well. But the credibility gap is just simply saying that, that what is happening, what President Johnson says is happening, may not necessarily be happening. So people are just beginning to question, his authority and power and things like that somewhat. And we also have search and destroy missions, the act of destroying and burning the homes, crops, and livestock of the Vietnamese by U.S. forces to root out suspected Viet Cong ties. All right, so think about this. How much do you think morale or feeling good about something affects a war effort? A, I think it has a big impact on a war effort. B, I think it has very little impact on a war effort. Or C, I think morale can have somewhat of an impact on a war effort. So what do you think? How does morale impact a war effort? And our essential question, how did involvement in the Vietnam War expand? Okay, so Johnson gained support. In 1965, many Americans supported the decision of President Johnson to send troops to support South Vietnam. By the end of the year, there were more than 180,000 U.S. forces in Vietnam. General William Westmoreland, he was the commander of those troops, and he's really not too impressed with the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, or like we said, the South Vietnamese Army. So he requests more U.S. forces to help build up some support for the fight against North Vietnam and the Viet Cong and things like that. And by 1967, there will be 500,000 troops in Vietnam. So about 2 years later, you can see how much that number increased to 500,000 troops in Vietnam. Now, many believe that the superior military and weapons of the U.S. would make this a short war, but this belief would prove to be false. So despite lacking modern weapons, the Viet Cong were able to use other strategies to achieve success during the conflict. Things they used hit-and-run ambush attacks. They also knew the jungle, so they were familiar with the jungle. They were familiar with the layout of the jungle, so they were able to move quickly through them and hide in them pretty easily. And also another thing is that attacks came in the jungle, and they also came in the countryside, and also in cities. Troops would, go into, maybe a restaurant or something like that in, a town or something like that, and somebody may throw a grenade in there and kill 4 or 5 American troops, or they may talk to a civilian and the civilian may pretend to be their friend, and then the civilian goes and tells the Viet Cong what the American plans are the next day, where their troops are going to be moving to. So again, just a lot of tricky stuff that was going on in Vietnam. The environment was also covered with landmines, booby traps, and tunnels. That's how the Viet Cong moved around a lot of the times, was in these underground tunnels. And they also used a lot of booby traps. One of the things that they used for booby traps was these things called punji sticks. And they were these sharp sticks, sharp bamboo wooden sticks that would be covered over with grass. So they were placed in the ground, dug in a hole, and then if an American soldier didn't see it and stepped on, they would fall on these sharp sticks. And a lot of times these sticks were covered with either animal feces or human feces, and so if an American stepped on it and went through his boot or his leg or whatever, not only was he injured by the stick, piercing his body, but also then you had the infection of the feces if it was covered in feces. So just a lot of dirty, nasty tactics that the Viet Cong used to try and injure American soldiers. So Westmoreland believed that the U.S. could wear the Viet Cong down. I'm sorry, that should say, and I'm sorry, yes, by wearing the Viet Cong down and keeping account of how many have been killed. So by saying, oh, we killed 5,000 Viet Cong today, he believed that that would, break the spirits of the Viet Cong. Now, despite some high losses, the Viet Cong continued the fight, and they received some help from the Chinese, and they also received some help from the Soviet Union. Of course, they're receiving some help from Ho Chi Minh in the northern part of Vietnam, which we talked about in the last lesson about the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And another big factor to remember about the Vietnam War, and keep this in mind as we go through it, is the U.S. was simply fighting a military conflict. There was no real, I don't want to say there wasn't investment in it, but it was different to the Viet Cong because the Viet Cong were fighting for something stronger they believed in. The American soldier was just fighting a military conflict, where a lot of the Viet Cong soldiers were fighting strongly for their beliefs and views, and that's a little different. When you're fighting for your beliefs and your views, it's a little you tend to fight maybe a little stronger than somebody else. So that's just kind of another opinion to take on it. So another part of the strategy for the United States was winning the support from rural parts of South Vietnam. Now, to do this, the U.S. used napalm to expose tunnels and hideouts of the Viet Cong. That's that gasoline firebomb. They also used Agent Orange, which we thought was like a toxic chemical that could kill leaves and things like that. But the use of both these weapons killed and wounded many civilians and destroyed villages. Troops also used search and destroy missions to root out suspected ties of Viet Cong as well. So the lack of progress and fighting in this, difficult environment in the jungle and the booby traps and all that kind of lowered the spirits of U.S. troops. Some of them turned to drugs and alcohol. Even some of them actually murdered their superior officers. There were cases of that where some of them kind of just snapped and murdered their superior officers. The continued instability of the South Vietnamese government was also frustrating. The Americans saw that, they were fighting for this government and for this way of life, and they really didn't see any changes being made. So, of course, that was also frustrating as well. But still, many soldiers believed in the fight of stopping the spread of communism. And also, just with the South Vietnamese government, they had started, a lot of the policies they kept before, and monks and things like that had started lighting themselves on fire again. So, again, just a lot of different things going on that is kind of bringing troop morale down a little bit. So the war home front. So as the war continued, the economy began to decline. Obviously, when you're spending money on a war, your national income is going to take a hit. Inflation, or the rise of prices, sharply increased rather quickly, so the price of things went up fairly quick. So to fund the war, Johnson proposed raising taxes. Now, people in Congress do agree to this, but many conservatives in Congress agreed to raising taxes, but only if Johnson would reduce spending on Great Society programs. Remember, this was a big part of President Johnson's, goals, was his Great Society program against poverty and things like that. So this kind of hurts him a little bit that he has to cut spending on his Great Society programs. Another thing to keep in mind is that television and the media is going to allow Americans to witness the fighting in Vietnam in their living rooms. This is also known as the living room war. So as Americans are sitting at home having their dinner at night or whatever, and sitting in front of the TV late at night, they're watching these images of these fightings and of these young men being wounded and things like that, and it begins to take an impact on the American people. They start to begin to question, like, maybe we're not in this for the right reasons. Maybe we should withdraw troops and let Vietnam figure it out. Another thing is that Johnson was saying, so many troops had died one day and the real numbers were, higher or whatever. And so many people began to question his credibility, and this is what we call the credibility gap. So again, Americans seeing the images and hearing from Johnson himself, maybe not the truth, had a lot of Americans questioning their government and questioning, the fight in Vietnam. All right, so remember in the early part of the year, early part of the war, I should say, I'm sorry, President Johnson received a large support for the war in the beginning. There were 500,000 troops in the region by 1967. In terms of fighting, U.S. soldiers fought a new opponent with different tactics. We talked about booby traps and the difficulty of fighting in the jungle and things like that. And then some soldiers did struggle with the combat. Many began to question, maybe why they were there, or turn to alcohol and drugs, or whatever the case may be. But again, I want you to remember too that a lot of soldiers did fight still, and believe in the fighting for the most part. Okay, the home front. So spending for the war began to rise and impact the economy. So many Americans, saw their taxes go up and the price of things go up. And then Americans began to question the war itself after seeing images of the fighting and of the conflict. Many began to question if this was the right thing to do. All right, guys. So again, submit this and you'll get extra credit and answer the questions. And I'll see you and talk to you later.